Hi guys, I'm Sarah, and welcome to episode 5 of my barn quilt project, the series where I recreate quilt blocks that I see on barns. The block I chose for this week I found on the side of a barn just outside of Sturgeon Falls, and it is part of the West Nipissing Barn Quilt Trail. Now, I'm going to be honest, I do not like the color choices for this block. It's fine on a barn, but as a block on an actual quilt that will go in my home, I just don't think the colors complement each other very well. However, that being said, I'm still going to give it a go, because embracing the barn quilts, as I see them, is a part of this challenge, and that includes the questionable color choices. So for this block, I needed purple, yellow, blue, orange, and teal. And luckily for me, I was able to find all of this fabric I needed in my scrap bin. The corners of this block were striped, so I decided to start by assembling these before moving on to the star. I constructed these similar to how you would a log cabin quilt block, but only working off of one corner of the central square. For each corner, I cut out a 4-inch square of the blue, a 1.5-inch by 4.5-inch rectangle of the yellow, a 1.5-inch by 5.5-inch rectangle of the yellow, a 1.5-inch by 5.5-inch rectangle of the purple, and a 1.5-inch by 6.5-inch rectangle of the purple. These pieces sewn together will not create the exact shape of the corner pieces, but I will trim them down later. I started by taking the blue square and the shorter yellow rectangle, and matching the corners and pinning them right sides together. The other end of the rectangle will overhang the blue square slightly, but that is okay. With that sewn together and pressed, I grabbed the longer yellow rectangle and pinned it across the edge where the blue and yellow pieces line up, matching the corner to the outer corner of the yellow. I sewed that up with a 1/4-inch seam allowance, and then gave it a press, pressing the seam towards the yellow. With the yellow stripe done, I moved on to the purple, and pinned the shorter purple rectangle onto the right yellow edge, lining it up at the corner. You could line this up on either edge, but I wanted to keep my seams consistent, so I chose to stick with the same side I started on. I again sewed it up with a 1/4-inch seam allowance and pressed the seam allowance towards the yellow. Just one more piece to add onto the corner, so I grabbed my longer purple rectangle and pinned it onto the other side of the piece, matching the corner with the strip I just sewed on. I sewed it up and pressed the seams towards the yellow, and then the corner was done. I repeated those steps 3 more times for the other corners. With that done, it was time to move on to the star. I started by cutting out a 3.5-inch square of the teal fabric for the middle. And then, for the points of the star, using the orange fabric, I cut out 4 triangles with a base of 3.5 inches and a height of 5 inches. I used a template for this to make measuring my triangles a lot easier. Once that was all cut out, I laid out my star and started assembling it by pinning the top and bottom star point onto the central square. The challenge posed by this block is that since the star is made up of 4 isosceles triangles, there are no straight lines going across the block. So all of the seams are going to be angled, and getting those to lay flat is what is going to be difficult. Anyways, I sewed up these seams with a 1/4-inch seam allowance and pressed the seams towards the middle. Once I was done, I was able to lay out my entire design, and I was really hoping it would grow on me, but it hasn't. By pressing on, I used the template I made to trim the corners down to the proper size to fit between the star points. Anything that's an odd shape, I find a template super helpful. I just cut this one out of a lasagna box. Next, I pinned the triangle for the star point between 2 of the corner pieces. You will see me pinning both sides here, but I did end up unpinning one side and sewing them up one at a time, since the corners will overlap slightly above the star point. I sewed up the first side of my triangle with a 1/4-inch seam allowance, and then pressed the seam before repinning on the other corner and sewing that seam. I pressed the seams away from the triangle, so hopefully the seams will nest with the seams on the central square that I pressed towards the middle. I repeated that entire process for the other 2 corners and the final star point, after which I was left with only 2 seams left to sew up. I started attaching the side piece to the middle by pinning the bottom edge of the orange triangle to the side of the central square and sewing up only that straight seam. Once I was sewn, I pinned the seam between the top star point and the top corner and sewed along that seam. Finally, I pinned the bottom star point to the bottom corner and sewed that seam. Essentially what I did is I treated the one edge that needed sewn as 3 separate seams to ensure that my pieces would all lay flat in the block. Once all 3 of these seams within a seam was sewn, I gave it a press and repeated the process for the other side. Unfortunately, the second side gave me a little more trouble than the first, and I did end up with warping of the stripes and a slight puckering of the central square. That's the thing about sharp stripes. You can really see it when you mess up. But with all of the sewing done, I just had to press it one last time and give it a final trim. Again, my block isn't perfect, but that's okay. It's really just the one corner that gave me trouble and ended up warping and puckering a little bit. The other 3 actually ended up looking pretty good at the end. The block that I have planned for next week only has 2 colors, so there will be a lot less fabric to deal with. But it does have 32 separate half-square triangles, so that'll be fun. Subscribe if you don't want to miss it. And there you have it, my slightly warped, very colorful North Star block. I hope that you guys liked watching my process of sewing this one. And as always, happy quilting.